BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Alright, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year I've been doing a regular segment about Jack the Ripper. And I would like to give a shout out to Bill McDermott, who's posed this topic by writing into the comments section. Could you do an episode on Joe Barnett as a Jack the Ripper suspect? And I'm trying to get to more of your requested topics, so if you have any ideas for a future episode, you can put them in the comment section down below. If you have something larger, you can send it to BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. My email address is in the description box. And first, I would like to give a little bit of introductory material, talking about some previous episodes of Ripper Wednesday. And about 2 weeks ago, I did an episode on Thomas Neal Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and he was one that is a little bit far out, a little bit of an extreme suspect. And I would like to give a shout out to Jay, who wrote something about Thomas Neal Cream's death in the comments section down below. Thomas Cream was a real-life Victorian serial killer, and he was executed. And at the gallows, it's alleged that his last words were, "I am Jack," and then the executioner pulled the lever and the plank opened, and then he fell through the trapdoor, and he was hanged before he could completely confess to being Jack the Ripper. Now, Jay wrote into the comments section saying that the story is actually that he said, "I am J." He didn't even say the name Jack at the gallows, and to be clear, to Jay's defense, he provided that as a possibility, as opposed to saying that he knew that as 100% fact, but that's one possible variant of the story. But when I was listening to the program Murder After Midnight, which was hosted by Ripperologist Martin Fido, he said that the executioner in the Cream case wrote a memoir at the end of his life, and he did not include that particular story. So I thought that that was really weird, and I wanted to see, is there any truth to that? Because you would think if this guy wrote a memoir, then he would have included something very important about a guy almost confessing to being Jack the Ripper. But I was online and I was searching, and I couldn't find the exact name of the book that would have been attributed to this executioner. The executioner's name was James Billington, and he is the subject of the book Billington, Victorian Executioner by Alison Bruce, and that is one that I'm going to have to look out for in the near future. But last week on Ripper Wednesday, I was talking about the Ripper suspect Montague John Druitt, and I said very clearly that at first I thought that he was going to be a reasonable Ripper suspect. However, that case quickly crumbled. More or less it crashed and burned. There are all types of problems and red flags associated with the story of Montague John Druitt, and I invite you guys to go back through some of these Ripper Wednesday suspect episodes. The episodes that have specifically been made about the Jack the Ripper suspects have been assembled into a playlist that is available here on Black Box Online Radio, and you can also hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these stories. And in the description box as well, there's a link to BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. Today's suspect is Joseph Barnett, who also went by the name Joe Barnett, as well as the alias Danny. I think Danny was just a nickname. He's referred to as Danny Barnett in some sources. And believe it or not, he starts out as a pretty good Ripper suspect again, but there are going to be major red flags with him as well. Firstly, Joe Barnett has a direct connection to the Ripper case. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in 1888, committing a crime spree that began on August 31st of that year, August 31st, and going till November 9th of 1888. The crime that took place on November 9th is the Ripper's most famous murder, so says me anyway, the murder of Mary Kelly, and Joseph Barnett was the roommate of Mary Kelly, and there are two versions of the events that have been shared. One of them is that he was Mary Kelly's ex-boyfriend or ex-lover, and that he committed this crime spree targeting women like Polly Nicholson, Annie Chapman, and Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes because he wanted Mary Kelly to be with him, and he wanted to scare her away from any type of dangerous life on the streets, not only associated with being a lady of the night, but also alcoholism, anything to do with that. So that's why women were murdered throughout what has been known as the Autumn of Terror, because he's just trying to scare her into going into a different life or submitting into his persuasive tactics. And when she refused, and when even that was not enough, he murdered Mary Kelly in a very, very savage way. So there is an explanation provided for the motive. There is a reason why this set of crimes was done in the way they were, but also there's a reason why the crime stopped, because Mary Kelly was the fixation. The final victim of Jack the Ripper was the fixation of this killer's intent. There was a direct reason why these crimes were being committed, and that's why after November 9th of 1888, the Ripper would not officially commit any other crimes. And as of now, I have not seen anything in the non-canonical Ripper crimes to suggest that anything happened after 1888, after November 9th of 1888, that was indeed the Ripper. But I do think there is a reasonable case that you could make for the murder of Martha Tabram, who was murdered prior to the, Autumn of Terror. She is a non-canonical Ripper victim, but there's a strong chance that she actually was murdered by the Ripper. She's the woman who was stabbed 39 times and was found outside. But I want to digress from that because some other variants of Joseph Barnett's theory is that he wasn't intensely involved in a relationship with Mary Kelly. Instead, he was primarily just her roommate, and that this was purely done out of jealousy, and even just rage toward women, and he wants her to be with him still. Still, she's the fixation of everything. She's the focus of everything in his theory, but that these crimes were purely committed out of jealousy. Now, Joseph Barnett was interrogated by the police, and they did not suspect him, and really he did not become a suspect until the 1970s, but some people think that maybe they just simply got it wrong. And also, the FBI went on to compose a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper, and we will compare that to the actions and activities of Joseph Barnett. And yes, it is the FBI. I mean, I had to do a double take on that because I was saying, well, certainly it must be Scotland Yard. No, it's the FBI. And if you're wondering, is it going to be the FBI profiler John Douglas? Yes, it will be from the FBI profiler John Douglas. He comes up a lot in true crime cases that I discuss here on Black Box Online Radio. And he has been mentioned in the Zodiac Killer case as well as in the JonBenet Ramsey case. And before I say anything about his observations, I want to be very clear. He is a real psychological profiler, and I am not. He worked for the FBI, and I did not. However, just because somebody knows a lot about psychology, it does not mean that all of their assumptions are going to be correct. So first I'll read off the psychological profile created by John Douglas. He believed that Jack the Ripper was a white male between 28 and 36 years old, living or working in Whitechapel. In childhood, the father figure was presumably absent or passive. The killer probably had a profession in which he could freely experience destructive tendencies. The killer probably stopped killing because he was arrested for another crime or he felt close to being discovered. The killer probably had some type of physical defect which was often generating frustration, anger, or disappointment. Now comparing that to Joseph Barnett, Joseph Barnett was 30 years old at the time, spent his entire life in and around Whitechapel. Joseph Barnett's father died when he was only 6 years old, so his father was not present for most of his life. Joseph Barnett worked in a fish market, so he was very good at handling knives, including filleting fish, and as well as the basic duties of working in a fish market. I think that is pretty clear. And Joseph Barnett was interrogated for 4 hours after Mary Kelly's murder, but the police seemed satisfied with his testimony and did not subsequently think that he was a suspect. And according to contemporary news, Barnett had what was called echolalia, which is where he has the repetition of certain sounds, if somebody asked him a question, then he would repeat words from the question back, repeating language from the question. And when I was reading the segment here that is actually shared on Wikipedia about echolalia, that's when somebody else says something and then the sound is repeated back. And if the person does it themselves, it's called palalalia. That's something that I actually experienced as a kid. I didn't know there was a difference between echolalia and palalalia, but when, like, for example, if I were to say the word box, I would say box, ox, 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 box, box. I would just start repeating the same sound. So it's not like a stutter, but it's a repetition. And, when dealing with serial killers who have some type of speech defect, this happens very frequently. The first one that comes to mind is Robert Christian Hansen, who was an Alaskan serial killer known as the Butcher Baker. He had a stutter growing up and he was bullied for it. Sure, I follow all of that. And, just saying that there'd be some type of defect that this person feels very insecure about. But, 30 years old, I do think is a reasonable age for a Jack the Ripper suspect, not like some of them who are in their 70s or some people who are just very young teenagers at the time. So, again, there are some points about having Joseph Barnett in as a reasonable suspect, but also he has a direct connection to one of the victims. He knew her personally, and then there's this wild story of how he would have committed these crimes to scare her out of her lifestyle so she would just be with him. I mean, that's very hard to comprehend, but crazier things have happened. Now, I'm going to share something with you guys that I read on the website, mindono.com, M-I-N-D-O-N-O, mindono.com. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But what they said was something about Jack the Ripper, but it is relevant to all serial killers, meaning the post was about Jack the Ripper, but you could apply this to other people. And that was that serial killers don't tend to operate for a particular motive. The crimes are often motiveless. They are not done for things such as greed, jealousy, or revenge. Greed, jealousy, revenge. These are not typical behaviors that serial killers, or typical motives that serial killers will have. And I would love to know your response to that, because, believe it or not, I do think the point about greed would actually be something that is a reasonable point, that serial killers don't tend to operate because of greed, and it's purely for a labeling reason. When you have a serial killer, the primary function of their activities has to be murder. They're killing for the sake of killing. Or if you want to talk about a motive, sexual gratification, or some type of rewarding impulse in the brain. We're talking about neurochemicals here. And that means that crimes that are drug-related or gang-related or financially related, those often don't fall into the category of serial killers, even though a crime that is drug-related, gang-related, or financially related could involve multiple murders. Murder is not the primary focus. Okay, so that one I mostly agree with, but revenge? Revenge, there definitely are serial killers who are revenge-oriented, or revenge is their primary motive. The first one that comes to mind is David Meyerhofer, who was known as the Montana child killer, as well as, he's the subject of the book Shadow Man, and Meyerhofer's primary reason why he committed murders was because he wanted revenge on certain people. He killed one boy because he had a dispute with the boy's brother and he wanted to terrorize him. He killed a Boy Scout because the Boy Scout didn't actually do anything to him. He wanted revenge on the Boy Scout troop for excluding him in the past. He killed a woman because she was ignoring him. And the only victim that doesn't really fall into that category was perhaps Meyerhofer's most famous crime, the murder of Susan Yeager, which he said was more of an impulse killing. But he is an example of a revenge serial killer. That can definitely happen. And if you're going to say that Joseph Barnett is the suspect for the Ripper crimes, or your suspect for the Ripper crimes, rather, he would fall into the jealousy angle. That, it's just it's difficult to try and wrap your head around this whole concept of how somebody would actually go out and murder 4 or 5 women just to convince somebody to be with him as a romantic partner. There must have been another way. There must have been a better way to go about things if that were indeed true. And I'm not endorsing that particular theory, but believe it or not, I can comprehend it. I'd say that I can comprehend it. I haven't digested it yet, but I can comprehend that particular angle. However, that's a very, very bold statement, though, about how somebody would not be a serial killer for greed, jealousy, or revenge. What do you think about that? And as far as the reason why the killing stopped, number one, the motive was achieved, the goal was achieved. Mary Kelly was no longer in the picture, and she's the obsession that this suspect would have had. But what I would add in addition to that is they believe, and even stated by FBI profiler John Douglas, that the killer most likely stopped because he was very scared of being caught, or again, the goal has been accomplished. But as far as fear of being caught, yes, that is very real. Well, like we get this question all the time. What would make Jack the Ripper stop killing? What would make some other serial killer stop killing? Fear of getting caught is an enormous factor. On the channel recently, I was talking about the Scotch tape killer, Robert Leroy Anderson, and he committed 2 crimes in 1994. He committed a murder, and then with the second crime in 1994, the victim was able to get away. And then he was so scared of getting caught, he didn't operate again until 1996, almost 2 years later. This is what creates gaps in serial killers' activities. It is a real thing. One more time, he was the Scotch tape killer, not Scotch tape killer, duct tape killer. Duct tape killer. Excuse me if I said Scotch tape. I was thinking about the Scotch tape letter in the Zodiac case. He was the duct tape killer. Let's look at the counterclaims against somebody such as Joseph Barnett. Number one, you would have to accept that the police were just so amazingly incompetent at the time that they had the Ripper right in front of them, and he's interrogated for 4 hours, and nothing stands out to them to make them think that this guy was indeed Jack the Ripper. He must have been the most persuasive con artist in the world if he was able to get away with that. Point number two, just because he's worked in a fish market and he knows how to fillet a fish and he knows a little bit about how to use a knife, or let's even say he's pretty good at using a knife, how is that on par with cutting out organs in the human body? I mean, how would he have learned all that stuff? Catherine Eddowes had her kidney cut out, for goodness sake, and also multiple of the Ripper victims had organs extracted, particularly the uterus, and so on. Now, I'm going off of memory on this one, so please don't quote me on this, but I believe with Mary Kelly, her uterus was actually cut out and left near the upper part of her body, and her heart was removed. But that is also something that, I mean, those specific details. The point is, the Ripper is handling organs, so, I mean, I don't see any medical knowledge involved with this, this fishmonger. But also, here is something else that serves as an additional challenge. Joseph Barnett is not the only suspect who has a direct connection to the victims now, because we also have Charles Lechmere, and at the very least, he has a direct connection to the crime scene at the murder of Polly Nichols. Charles Lechmere, also known as Charles Cross, and he can be definitively placed at the crime scene. I don't mean like he was a friend or he was an associate of Polly Nichols, but it's the pointing out that just because someone has a connection to one of the victims, it's like, which suspect are you going to go with now? And this thing about the whole police interrogation shouldn't be downplayed. I mean, you would just have to wonder how he would be able to talk his way out of something like that, and they wouldn't suspect a thing. And there's an additional point that I mentioned in the Montague Drawn Druid episode, and I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but this is a counterclaim all the same. A guy like Joseph Barnett was English, and many people believe that Jack the Ripper was Jewish and from another country, like a Polish Jew like Aaron Kosminski, or Russian like Alexander Petachenko. I mean, there's some issues with Petachenko. I should have said Louis Diemschutz as another foreign Jew, but they don't believe that Jack the Ripper was an Englishman, and I actually use that as a question on the channel every day on Black Box Online Radio. I'm now including a poll, and I'm sharing a previous episode, but I'm asking polling questions, and one of them was, do you believe that Jack the Ripper was English, Polish, Russian, or Irish? And most people said English or Polish. I think a lot of them are thinking about Aaron Kosminski as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and this is based on the few people who actually had a look at a suspect leaving the crime scenes. Again, I do not subscribe to that theory, but that's theirs. I simply don't think they would have enough knowledge about the person to say with certainty that Jack the Ripper was not English and that he was Jewish. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. There's even a reasonable claim that you can make to that, but I'm not convinced. So, with Joseph Barnett, those are the red flags that I would address. Not having medical knowledge. I mean, whatever about his national origin, I mean, we can even take that one off the table. I mean, other people are going to have a first-hand connection to the crime scenes. I just mentioned Louis Deemschutz. He had a first-hand connection to the crime scene after the murder of Liz Stride. I mean, just because this guy, Joseph Barnett, had a previously existing relationship with Mary Kelly, it does not mean that it was a homicidal tendency. That is something that needs to be highlighted. And the psychological profiling really does stand out to me. I mean, all of those markers do come into play, and I mean, I said some critical things about John Douglas, and I'll elaborate about that a little bit, because when I said that he knows a lot more about psychology than I do, but it appears that he's making an enormous amount of assumptions, and I don't see how all of them could be true. He created a psychological profile of the JonBenet killer, but the killer of JonBenet Ramsey, her murder took place in 1996, but it's based purely on the assumption that no one is trying to deceive anybody, that the stage could not be seen, that the scene could not be staged, or that somebody couldn't be trying to manipulate evidence to make somebody think something different. And again, he just takes everything in at face value, which maybe you have to do at psychological profiling, but I don't want to do that. I want to look at, hey, wait a second, is this person telling the truth? But believe it or not, I'm actually seeing smaller red flags with somebody like Joseph Barnett as opposed to last week's suspect Montague John Druitt because of a very particular reason, the explanation about why the crime stopped, meaning that Mary Kelly died. With Montague John Druitt, he didn't commit suicide until 3 weeks after the murder of Mary Kelly, and then they're trying to say that, well, he committed the murder of Mary Kelly because of mental deterioration, yet he goes on and works his daily life and nobody notices anything for 3 weeks until he's dismissed from his job, and then he commits suicide and he's found dead in the River Thames. All right, so that just doesn't add up to me. If someone is just completely out of touch with reality and they're just some type of uncontrollable maniac, yet they go on to just live ordinarily for 3 weeks before they have another outburst, I don't think so. And that's purely my take on the subject. Whereas we look at Joseph Barnett and the explanation that has been provided, Mary Kelly was the focus of everything. Now she's dead. Now he's terrified that he's going to get caught. So that's why the crime stopped. And I can comprehend that in a clearer way. But if you would like to challenge me on that, put your ideas in the comment section down below. Tell me what you genuinely think about Joseph Barnett as a Jack the Ripper suspect. If you notice a major red flag in his suspect profile that I didn't get to, I would love to read your comment down below and, share some things. And if you have something larger, once again, you can send it to BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.